Previously on Unknown Military History, we left off on the aftermath of the Third War of the Diadochi, which had far-lasting consequences on the empire of Alexander the Great. An ancient dynasty, the Argiads of Macedon, now lay dead at the hands of Cassander, and thus the lineage of Alexander the Great was wiped out. Meanwhile, far to the south, Ptolemy of Egypt had begun another war of aggression against the powerful Antigonus, whose holdings stretched from Anatolia to India. Meanwhile, Antigonus was surrounded by enemies though, after recently losing most of his far eastern provinces to an upstart warlord, Seleucus and Nicator. Meanwhile, Lysimachus, the ruler of Thrace, watches on, as war seems afoot again between Antigonus and Ptolemy. While Antigonus had been busy fighting the Babylonian War against his new rival, Seleucus, for control of the east, Ptolemy had made his move. Capturing the important island of Cyprus, he would use it as a staging ground for naval dominance in that region, as well as in the Aegean Sea off of Greece. However, upon Seleucus's victory in the war, Antigonus was forced back west, while Seleucus went east to deal with his own eastern problems, which will be discussed later. Antigonus thus sent his son Demetrius with a force to regain control of Greece and overthrow Cassander, whom had turned on Antigonus in the last war. In the year 307 BC, Demetrius and his forces marched into the city of Athens after a brief siege and expelled Cassander's officials. Upon entry into Athens, Demetrius declared freedom to all Greeks from Cassander's grip. Demetrius then besieged and captured the nearby city of Munichia. The Athenians were overjoyed at being liberated from the rule of Cassander, whom they despised. Thus they began to worship their liberator Demetrius. They imposed on him the Greek title Soter, which means savior. Demetrius was one of the first Greeks who would be hailed as a god by the city. During his time in Athens, Demetrius would marry Eurydice, an Athenian woman descended from Miltiades, the Athenian general whom had defeated the Persians many years ago at the Battle of Marathon, a battle which secured Greek independence and resistance to Persian rule. However, during that time, Antigonus began preparations for a major naval campaign against Ptolemy. While Seleucus was being bottled up in his eastern wars, Ptolemy was Antigonus's main threat. Thus, Antigonus sent out letters to his son Demetrius, his other satraps and generals, and to the stronghold and independent island city of Rhodes to support him in his naval campaign. However, Rhodes refused to lend aid to Antigonus, but this did not deter him from starting his campaign. Once again, Demetrius would play a major role in the upcoming battles. Thus, Demetrius crossed over to the island of Cyprus with a large army that included 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. Demetrius also had a fleet which numbered 53 heavy ships, or quinqueremes, and 110 lighter ships, or triremes. At the time, Cyprus was governed as a province by none other than Ptolemy's brother Menelaus. Menelaus had 12,000 infantry, 800 cavalry, and 60 ships. One of the greatest battles of the Diadochi Wars was about to begin. Landing on the Carpathia Peninsula, Demetrius fortified himself. The fort which he ordered to be built consisted of both a palisade and moat and was on the coast. From this spot, Demetrius would launch raids in the area. Shortly afterward, he captured the towns of Carpathia and Urania. With the initial offensive successful, Demetrius decided to march on land to face Menelaus in open battle outside the city of Salamis, the capital of Cyprus. This small engagement has been little more than a footnote in history, but according to the historian Diadochi Siculus, Demetrius emerged a victor, albeit it was only a minor victory. Menelaus was able to retreat, but lost 1,000 men, while a large number of captured soldiers joined Demetrius' army. However, suspicious of a possible defection, Demetrius sent these captives to Antigonus in Syria. Following his defeat, Menelaus made ready for what would be a large siege by Demetrius of Salamis. Menelaus ordered his soldiers to mount catapults on the walls. He also sent messengers to Ptolemy for reinforcements. Meanwhile, Demetrius ordered siege weapons to be built, many of which he designed himself. These included 2 large battering rams, which included canopies to protect them from enemy fire, and a 9-level mobile siege tower known as a Heliopolis, which was equipped with catapults and ballista on each level. This massive structure was manned by over 200 of Demetrius' soldiers. Thus, Demetrius ordered a combined assault of Salamis using his ingenious siege weapons in coordination with his fleet. After bombarding and attempting to breach the city for a few days, eventually one of Demetrius' machines forced a breach in the wall. This moment nearly proved decisive, but during the night, Menelaus ordered his men to use flaming arrows, setting Demetrius' siege engine on fire. Meanwhile, Ptolemy had sailed from Alexandria towards Cyprus with his fleet. Arriving on Paphos, on the western coast of Cyprus, his 140 warships and over 10,000 men reinforced Menelaus. The Ptolemies now outnumbered the Antigonids. The historian Plutarch states how Ptolemy sent an ultimatum to Demetrius to leave Cyprus, while Demetrius responded by saying he would, if Ptolemy withdrew his garrisons from Antigonid-claimed cities in Greece such as Corinth. As usual, negotiations failed. Hoping for a swift victory against Demetrius, Ptolemy attempted to try and make a dash during the night from Citium, around Cape Greco, and to Salamis. This was meant to join up with his brother Menelaus' forces so they could take on an outnumbered Demetrius together. However, Demetrius found out about Ptolemy's arrival in the region, and he took steps to impede him. Demetrius thus equipped his ships with missile throwers, brought aboard his best troops as marines, and sailed his fleet to anchor outside of the city, blocking Menelaus in the harbor. Demetrius needed a victory against Ptolemy's forces to prevent himself from being outflanked. Right after dawn the next day, Ptolemy and his fleet would encounter Demetrius and his fleet deployed outside the city waiting for them. Thus began the naval combat at the Battle of Salamis. Demetrius deployed the bulk of his navy against Ptolemy, around 180 vessels. He left around 10 quinqueremes under Antisthenes to blockade Salamis and prevent Menelaus from breaking out. Meanwhile, Demetrius placed himself at the left wing on his flagship. Demetrius' best ships were placed under the command of Medius of Larissa, some 10 quinqueremes and 10 hexeres. Ptolemy, on the other hand, ordered his transport ships carrying his army to fall back behind his main fleet. He placed himself on the left like Demetrius, commanding his fleet in person. According to the historian Diadochi, when the two fleets were 3 stadia apart, the gilded shield, which was the signal to attack, was raised by Demetrius and Ptolemy at around the same time. During the course of the battle, Demetrius' left wings proved victorious. Remember that naval battles in the ancient world consisted of both boarding and ramming, and today proved to be Demetrius' day. As his fleet managed to sink the majority of Ptolemy's fleet or overrun them, Ptolemy attempted to break through Demetrius' center. When Ptolemy's men boarded Demetrius' flagship, it was said that Demetrius distinguished himself in the fight by hurling his javelins at some of them and by striking others at close range with a spear, despite being subject to many misses of all sorts. During the fierce fighting, Demetrius' 3 bodyguards tried to protect him, but one was cut down while the other 2 were mortally wounded. As the battle progressed, it became apparent that Demetrius' fleet proved superior that day, and Ptolemy ordered a retreat. Meanwhile, Menelaus was able to break through the blockade, only to find that the battle was already over. In the aftermath of the battle, Demetrius awarded his men for their bravery. In particular, his Athenian troops had fought well, and Demetrius sent 1,200 suits of armor to Athens as a reward for their help. After picking up men from the sea and capturing more of Ptolemy's fleeing ships, Demetrius returned to triumph in his tent. The Battle of Salamis had been Demetrius' finest hour thus far, and one of the most resounding victories for the Antigonid faction. Demetrius had only lost around 20 ships, while Ptolemy had lost nearly 80 ships. Out of the ships lost, Demetrius was able to capture and put to use 40 of them, increasing his naval power. He also captured or killed around 8,000 of Ptolemy's troops while suffering minimal casualties. Among Demetrius' prisoners was Leonstichus, a son of Ptolemy, as well as Lamia of Athens, a courtesan who would later become Demetrius' mistress. Meanwhile, Demetrius' pioneering use of siege weapons in coordination with his forces would earn him the nickname Poliorcorides. Now known as Demetrius, quote, the Besieger, he readied himself for future campaigns. On the other hand, the battle had been a disaster for Ptolemy. Egypt's naval power was completely destroyed, and he was forced to retreat to Egypt. Menelaus was forced to surrender Salamis and his garrison, effectively ending the vital strategic island of Cyprus to Antigonus and Demetrius. Yet despite this, Demetrius still showed some form of chivalry to Ptolemy by returning Ptolemy's relatives and subordinates to him, as well as his baggage train, just like Ptolemy had done to him several years ago when he defeated him at the Battle of Gaza. The effects of this battle would be even greater, however. When Antigonus heard the news of Demetrius' massive victory, he became emboldened. Due to the fact that Alexander's family had been killed off by Cassander, the struggle over who would rule the empire was now every man for himself. Thus, Antigonus assumed the Macedonian crown, declaring himself the rightful ruler of the empire and elevating his son Demetrius as co-ruler. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander would also follow suit later that year. The wars of the Diadochi had taken on a new era now, that every man claimed to be king. Later that year, in 306 BC, Antigonus decided to take advantage of Ptolemy's weakness and invade Egypt. However, he was stopped by none other than storms, which hindered Demetrius' fleet from supplying him. It is possible that history could have been different had the invasion of Egypt not been met with untimely weather. Thus, Antigonus decided to return his attention to another island stronghold, Rhodes. The island of Rhodes was independent and was ruled by a mercantile republic, which made the city a bastion through its trade, similar to the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa during the Renaissance era. In order to protect their trading industry, Rhodes had maintained treaties of neutrality with the various hostile Diadochi warlords, such as Antigonus and Ptolemy, who were currently at war. Therefore, Rhodes had elected not to aid Antigonus and Demetrius in their war against Ptolemy. Despite their declared neutrality, however, Rhodes had a close trading relationship with Ptolemy. Worried that Rhodes might provide ships for Ptolemy in the aftermath of his defeat at Salamis, Demetrius decided to lay siege to the city, recognizing its strategic value. The decision to lay siege to Rhodes sent shockwaves throughout the Hellenic world. Whether or not people were on the side of the Antigonids, many viewed this act as a brazen pirate attack against a neutral city. Bringing with him an army of 40,000 men and 170 ships, Demetrius was to conduct one of the most memorable battles of the war. However, Demetrius' siege of Rhodes also attracted a number of independent pirate fleets to his side, eager to gain their share of the spoils should Demetrius take the city. So the statement before was pretty accurate. For the Rhodians, their survival was at stake, as they had a force of around 6,000 citizens and 1,000 foreigners and slaves in the city. Yet all of these Rhodians decided to pitch in and defend their island. Demetrius first aimed to capture the harbor of Rhodes, as it was strongly fortified and would prevent Demetrius to use supply ships to run his blockade. Using his skill in siege warfare, Demetrius built his own harbor alongside the original and constructed from a mole. From this, he deployed a floating boom. However, despite this, he could not capture the main harbor due to its strong fortifications and stalwart defenders. Demetrius then had his army ravage the island for resources before building a camp next to the city. As the siege progressed, some of Demetrius' troops were able to breach a section of the walls. However, the defenders, rallying under a man named Ares, managed to kill many of the attackers due to the fact that Demetrius failed to press the attack. Over the course of the long siege, both sides used many forms of technological weapons such as mines, countermines, and siege engines. Demetrius even constructed a massive Heliopolis, or a movable siege tower. This siege tower was massive, weighing 160 tons and 130 feet high and 60 feet wide, and it was manned by a crew of around 3,400 men and included catapults and dart throwers. However, as the Heliopolis was being pushed toward the city, the Rhodian defenders managed to dislodge some of its metal plates. As they prepared to try and burn the massive device, Demetrius ordered it withdrawn. Meanwhile, the island was reinforced by troops sent by Ptolemy, hindering any advances from Demetrius. The siege continued to drag out for the rest of the year until 304. Eventually, Demetrius and the Rhodians, recognizing the siege was lasting forever, decided to come to an agreement. Rhodes agreed to support Antigonus and Demetrius against all enemies besides Ptolemy, and were allowed to keep their trade deals, while Demetrius allowed the city to remain independent. However, the unpopularity of the siege and its diplomatic repercussions may have been the real reason which caused Demetrius to end the siege. Ultimately, the battle was a strategic victory for Demetrius, while for the Rhodians it was a decisive tactical victory, as they were able to keep their independence. The Rhodians would even construct the famous Colossus of Rhodes from Demetrius' abandoned Heliopolis to commemorate their stalwart defenders. This statue, which portrayed the sun god Helios, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Meanwhile, Ptolemy would earn the title of Savior, or Soter, for helping to prevent the fall of the city by aiding it. However, the war raged on. Not long after the siege of Rhodes, Cassander had managed to invade the island of Salamis and besiege Athens, which was under Antigonid rule. Demetrius thus gathered a large fleet and landed his army in Boeotia behind Cassander's forces. Renewing his alliance with many disgruntled Greek city-states, Demetrius and his allies raised the siege of Athens and drove Cassander from central Greece. Later, in 303, Demetrius marched his forces south into the Peloponnese and captured several major cities, such as Corinth. By the end of that campaign, Demetrius had brought the northern and central Peloponnese into Antigonid possession. He would declare the formation of the League of Corinth, which was an alliance under himself and his father Antigonus to defend the Greek cities from enemies such as Cassander. In the meantime, far to the east, Seleucus had been dealing with his own battles. Having recently secured Babylon, Persia, and the eastern satrapies reaching as far as the Indus Valley bordering India, Seleucus would be forced to secure his eastern flank against a major threat which came from that region. To the east, in the Indian subcontinent, there were various ethnic Indian kingdoms. These kingdoms were constantly at war and trade with one another in the outside world. The Greeks had made their first contact with these Indians when Alexander the Great defeated a local king, Porus, at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Despite Alexander's desire to push into the Indian continent itself, his troops had demanded him to return home, and thus India had been largely untouched by outside forces. Around this time, the most powerful state within India was the Nanda Empire, but now was falling to a new upstart power, the Mauryans. Led by an energetic conqueror named Chandragupta Maurya, the Mauryan-Nanda War would last for nearly 11 years before Chandragupta managed to conquer the empire for himself with the capture of the Nanda capital, Pataliputra, establishing the Mauryan Empire. This empire was vast and powerful, being able to field hundreds of thousands of warriors and hundreds of Indian war elephants. During the course of the Mauryan Empire's rapid expansion on the Indian continent, it had also invaded lands of the Indus Valley region, which had been pacified by Alexander the Great years ago, and was now claimed by Seleucus Nicator. The Mauryans had annexed regions governed by a number of satraps, which nominally were vassals of Seleucus. Seeking to take back those lost regions and solidify its hold on the Indus Valley region, Seleucus would come into conflict with Chandragupta Maurya. Unfortunately, The exact details of any battles fought during the Seleucid-Marian War are lost to time, and the sources we do have are too varied to be verified. However, what all sources agree on is that the Marians had the better end of the short conflict. Not wanting to extend the war any further, as he had more pressing matters west, Seleucus would sign a treaty with Chandragupta Maurya. In the terms of the treaty, Seleucus and Chandragupta signed a truce. Seleucus would have to cede many of his most eastern satrapies to Chandragupta and give the hand of his daughter Helena to Chandragupta to found a very unique dynastic alliance. Meanwhile, Chandragupta would gift Seleucus 500 Indian war elephants, and thus ended the brief Seleucid-Marian War. The settlement of Greeks in Indian lands would have consequences in the future, as it created a unique blend of both cultures in these particular regions. Seleucus thus now decided to take the long march west to meet up with his allies and fight Antigonus. Meanwhile, Cassander had tried to sue for peace with Antigonus in the face of his setbacks in Greece. However, Antigonus rejected these demands, and Demetrius invaded Thessaly. Demetrius and Cassander would fight a number of inconclusive battles before Lysimachus would change the theater of the conflict entirely. Lysimachus, the governor and now declared king of Thrace, whom had spent the majority of this era fighting against barbarians from the north, now heeded the call of his allies. Lysimachus thus marched his forces into Anatolia, overrunning the majority of the province. When Antigonus heard of the invasion, he began to quickly march his army northwards from Syria in order to face Lysimachus. However, Lysimachus avoided open battle with Antigonus, as he was waiting for the forces of Cassander and Seleucus to reinforce him. Lysimachus set up a large camp with entrenchments and palisades in order to prevent Antigonus from attacking him. As the winter set in, Antigonus received reports that Seleucus was marching from the east to support Lysimachus. Because of this, Antigonus sent out messengers to Demetrius, who was campaigning in Greece, to reinforce him. Arranging a quick truce with Cassander, Demetrius took his army by sea across the Aegean and recaptured Ephesus, which had been taken by Lysimachus before reuniting with his father Antigonus. Cassander, though having negotiated a truce with Demetrius out of desperation, was able to send reinforcements to Lysimachus, though Cassander would remain in Greece himself. Meanwhile, far to the south, Ptolemy took advantage of Antigonus and Demetrius being held up by Lysimachus and Cassander's forces to try and conquer Syria. Though Ptolemy was able to capture a number of cities during the siege of Sidon, he received false reports that Antigonus had been victorious in a great battle, and therefore Ptolemy withdrew back to Greece and would not partake in the battle that was about to take place. At around the same time, Seleucus had been marching west with his army, including the Indian war elephants given to him by the Marians. Seleucus's march was extraordinary. Indeed, if more sources survived on detailing how he was able to march at such a fast rate from the easternmost regions of his domain to the west in Anatolia to meet up with Lysimachus and Cassander's forces, this march would likely rival that of Hannibal's march across the Alps during the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage years later. And thus, the Battle of Ipsus was about to begin. This battle would be the most important engagement in the Wars of the Diadochi and would decide the fate of the most powerful man in Alexander's broken empire. Antigonus and Demetrius had around 70,000 pikemen, 10,000 cavalry, and 75 war elephants. However, Antigonus and Demetrius had also brought with them a man known as Pyrrhus, who at the time was the young exiled ruler of the independent Greek kingdom of Epirus, but had married into the Antigonid family. Pyrrhus was also a second cousin of Alexander the Great himself. Antigonus became impressed by Pyrrhus's knack for military command, and even stated that Pyrrhus would become the greatest general of his time if he lived long enough. Indeed, Pyrrhus would have a storied career ahead of him, which deserves a series of its own. But as for right now, he was an ally fighting for the first time, in the major battle at Ipsus for the Antigonids. Meanwhile, the allied forces of Lysimachus, Seleucus, and the reinforcements of Cassander totaled 64,000 pikemen, 10,500 cavalry, 120 scythe chariots, and 400 Indian war elephants. Both the Antigonids and their respective enemies deployed their troops in a standard Macedonian battle formation. This consisted of the phalanx of pikemen in the center, while light skirmisher infantry were on the flanks of the phalanx, and the cavalry was split on the far wings of both flanks. On the Antigonid side, Demetrius commanded the cavalry stationed on the right wing, which included Pyrrhus of Epirus. Antigonus was stationed behind the center, with his personal bodyguard behind the phalanx, while his 75 elephants were deployed in front of the battle line with their infantry guards. On the allied side, Seleucus' son, Antiochus, commanded the cavalry on the left wing. On the right wing cavalry were Lysimachus, and the Indian war elephants were commanded by Seleucus, though some other sources state Seleucus was with the cavalry. The Battle of Ipsus began with a clash of elephants from both sides. As the elephants were fighting, Demetrius maneuvered his cavalry around them and attacked the contingent of Seleucus' son Antiochus. Demetrius completely routed Antiochus and the cavalry and gave chase. Meanwhile, the two phalanxes engaged each other in a deadlock. As the phalanxes clashed, Seleucus ordered his remaining war elephants to blockade the direction which Demetrius had gone to rout Antiochus earlier in the battle. Meanwhile, Antigonus sent out an order to Demetrius to return to the main side of the battlefield and attack the rear of Seleucus and Lysimachus' phalanx, which had been exposed. However, as Demetrius headed back, he found his way blocked by Seleucus' war elephants. Many ancient sources state that the horses of Demetrius were alarmed by the smell and noise of the elephants and wouldn't move forward in their direction. Demetrius had been stopped. Now that the threat of Demetrius had been stopped in its tracks quite literally, the Antigonid phalanx was exposed on the right flank. As the phalanxes fought, Seleucus detached cavalry from his own right wing to move around and attack Antigonus' forces on the side. The morale of Antigonus' troops began to fall apart because of this maneuver, and some of Antigonus' infantry even defected to Seleucus and Lysimachus, who was commanding part of the cavalry which was engaged in the phalanx struggle. As Antigonus was outflanked, however, he continued to rally his men, never giving up hope that Demetrius might return and change the fate of the battle. Alas, Antigonus would meet a sad fate, killed by several javelins as he was being surrounded. And thus, Antigonus the One-Eyed, the man who had been the most powerful man in Alexander's broken empire, died that day at Ipsus at the age of 81. The Antigonid army and political power had totally been crushed that day at Ipsus, while Lysimachus and Seleucus came out as the victors, ready to create a new order. In the aftermath of the Battle of Ipsus, the allies decided to divide up the spoils between them. Seleucus received Antigonus' Asian territories, extending his empire, while Lysimachus received western Anatolia. Cassander received Cilicia and Lycia, giving them to his brother Plastarchus, who had fought at Ipsus. Meanwhile, Demetrius had managed to recover 5,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, managing to escape with them to Ephesus. Demetrius was little more than a fugitive, but he still had a number of island possessions and land in mainland Greece, and a large fleet. He left his protege, Pyrrhus of Epirus, in charge of the Antigonid cause in Greece, and with some troops to take back his throne in Epirus. Yet, the Battle of Ipsus was still not the end of the struggles over territory and rulership. Several years after the Battle of Ipsus, in 298 BC, Cassander would die, leaving the kingdom to his two sons, Antipater and Alexander V. Both proved to be weaker kings and prone to fighting each other, and thus Demetrius would take advantage of this. Mustering what forces he could, Demetrius and his ally Pyrrhus of Epirus led a joint invasion of mainland Greece. Demetrius managed to defeat Cassander's sons in battle, killing them and seizing control of Macedon for himself. However, Lysimachus and Ptolemy in Egypt would not stand for their old enemy Demetrius, and ended up forcing him out of Macedon after staging a rebellion against him there. It was at this point that Demetrius came into conflict with his protege Pyrrhus of Epirus, as Pyrrhus had his own grand ambitions to rule over Greece. Thus, Pyrrhus and Lysimachus divided the kingdom of Macedon between them. Pyrrhus' story, as stated before, would take many twists and turns and will be covered in a series of his own. Despairing, Demetrius left his remaining settlements in the Peloponnese under the control of his son Antigonus II, Gonatus. Desperate at a final attempt to defeat his enemies, Demetrius launched an invasion of Seleucus' vast Asian holdings, but this failed. Demetrius was captured by Seleucus, who treated him with dignity as a captive. However, by this point Demetrius had had enough and would drink himself to death within the year. Thus marks the end of the besiegers' adventures. The following year would see Lysimachus falling out with Pyrrhus and driving him out of Macedon back into Epirus, where he would launch campaigns in the west for the next decade. Meanwhile, in Egypt, an aging Ptolemy would declare his younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, as his heir over the elder Ptolemy Ceraunus. This was likely due to Ceraunus' reputation of being a destructive character, hence his nickname, the Thunderbolt. Ptolemy Ceraunus fled to Seleucus, joining his court. Later, in 282 BC, Ptolemy I Soter of Egypt passed away peacefully in his bed, and his son Philadelphus succeeded him. That same year, Lysimachus, either due to his madness or at the behest of one of his wives, had one of his sons, Agathocles, murdered in a brutal act. Agathocles' widow fled to Seleucus to ask him for help against Lysimachus. In 281 BC, Seleucus invaded his former ally's territory and defeated and killed Lysimachus at the Battle of Corpedium. For a short moment, Seleucus ruled over all of Alexander's former territory except for Egypt and the lands given to the Marians in the east. However, Ptolemy Ceraunus, who was in his court, stayed true to his epithet of Thunderbolt and suddenly assassinated Seleucus. While the reasons for this are unclear, it's likely because Ceraunus was hoping to claim Seleucus' lands as his own. This completely backfired, however, as Ptolemy Ceraunus was only able to hold on to Macedon and Thrace because Seleucus' son Antiochus had been appointed by Seleucus as the ruler of the Asian territories a year earlier. Ptolemy Ceraunus did not rule Macedon for long, as the chaos of the past 5 years had left the region vulnerable to northern invasion. Thus, a large Celtic invasion swept through Macedon, Greece, and Asia Minor. In the fighting, Ptolemy Ceraunus was killed. Meanwhile, the late Demetrius' son, Antigonus II Gonatus, had risen up during the chaos and managed to drive out the Celtic invaders and take the throne of Macedon for himself. Many of the Celts eventually settled in Anatolia, forming the region of Galatia. Thus, about 50 years after the death of Alexander the Great, a new and lasting order would be established, though his empire would never be reunited. Seleucus' son Antiochus ruled over Asia, as well as Seleucus' dynasty, for almost another century. The Antigonid dynasty, under Antigonus II Gonatus, ruled over Macedon, continuing the legacy of Demetrius and his father, Antigonus. Meanwhile, the Ptolemies ruled over Egypt. And as for the rest of the territories, a lot of them became independent Eastern and independent Greek city-states, remaining largely autonomous from these vast successor kingdoms. And with that, fellow viewers, is the end of this series of the Wars of the Diadochi. which detailed the power struggle of Alexander the Great's successors. I hope you have had as much pleasure listening to these events as I did writing them, and I will see you all in the next episode of a new series. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay tuned.